Welcome to Wisdom for the Present, where we take ancient truth and bring it into clear, modern understanding. This episode uses AI-generated narration based on human research and written material.
Absolutely.
So I want you to just picture this for a second. You are the single most powerful human being on Earth.
Right.
You're sitting in this freezing military tent on the frozen frontiers of the Danube.
Oh, yeah. Completely miserable conditions.
Right. You are surrounded by blood, mud, the relentless logistics of a massive army, and on top of all that, there's a plague that is just quietly suffocating millions of your citizens across the empire.
Yeah, not exactly a vacation.
No, not at all. So what do you do at night to keep from losing your mind?
Yeah.
What do you write in your private diary to maintain your humanity when absolutely everyone around you treats you like an actual god?
Right.
Well, today in this deep dive, we are opening that exact diary. We are looking at books 9 and 10 of Marcus Aurelius' Meditations. And I want to be clear, we are not approaching this as some dusty historical artifact.
No, definitely not.
We are looking at it as a survival manual for the human mind, because that's what it was for him.
It really is. And I mean, it's a remarkable document precisely because of that context you just laid out. When you read this, you're effectively eavesdropping on a man's innermost psychological conditioning.
Yeah.
He never intended for us to read this. He wasn't writing for an audience, which means, he wasn't posturing.
Right. There's no spin. And that's the exact lens we need to look through today, because for anyone listening who is, navigating modern chaos, whether that's dealing with manipulative people, leading a team under high stress, or just battling your own internal anxieties, there is a highly specific architecture to how Marcus processed reality.
Yeah, it's incredibly structured.
And he starts book 9 with a claim that, frankly, just stopped me in my tracks. He writes about the interconnected nature of the universe, and he uses the word impiety.
Oh, yeah. That's a huge concept for him.
He argues that to be unjust to another person is literally a crime against the universe itself.
Exactly. This is, it's the bedrock of Stoic physics, and it's a concept that fundamentally changes how you view your daily interactions. For Marcus, and really all the Stoics, the universe isn't just this dead, random collection of rocks and void.
Right.
It's a rational, living, interconnected entity. They believed in this permeating rational principle, the logos. He calls it the nature of the universe, and he views it as the common parent of absolutely everything that exists.
So he isn't just saying that, lying to someone in bad manners or a violation of some social contract.
Right. It's much bigger than that.
But I want to push back on the scale of his claim here, because he is essentially saying that cutting someone off in traffic or undermining a colleague at work is a violation of physics.
Yes. Exactly. Because in his view, you are not an isolated node. You're a functional piece of a unified whole. He writes that all reasonable creatures are made specifically to do one another good. So if you act unjustly, like if you deceive someone, if you hoard resources, if you willingly damage someone else, you're working against the actual fabric of reality. You're rejecting the function for which you were biologically and cosmically designed.
So it's like a gear spinning the wrong way in a machine.
Exactly. And to him, that is impiety. It is a rebellion against the cosmos itself.
That drastically raises the stakes of our behavior, doesn't it? It means there's really no such thing as a private moral failure. Everything ripples. But how does he justify this scientifically? Because I noticed later in book 9, he starts observing the natural world to back this up. He looks at how physical elements behave.
Yeah, he observes what we might call the physics of connection. He looks at the empirical world and he notes that things naturally seek their own kind, like Earth presses down to Earth.
Right, gravity.
Exactly. Liquid flows together. Water joins with water to form puddles, then rivers, then oceans. Fire naturally tends upwards, but also seeks out other fire to burn together in a single flame.
Right.
He basically says that anything partaking of a common nature naturally longs after its own kind. You see it biologically, too, in animals forming swarms, flocks, broods. He even extends this to the celestial bodies, arguing the stars and planets have this mutual sympathy, this gravitational rational pull toward one another.
And then, after laying out this beautiful unified theory of everything, from water droplets to constellations, he points out this glaring exception: humanity.
Yeah, that's a tragic irony.
He observes that human beings, the only creatures actually endowed with elevated reason, are the only creatures that actively forget their natural affection. We're the only ones who put effort into drifting apart.
It is a profound paradox. The entity with the highest capacity for connection, because we have reason and language, is the most prone to isolation. He views this division as fundamentally unnatural. It's like a glitch in our cognitive operating
It's
system.
a glitch, yeah.
But he also notes that despite our best efforts to isolate, to build walls and divide ourselves into factions, nature doth prevail. You can't truly live entirely by yourself.
Yeah.
The universe forces you back into the web, whether you resist it or not.
So if the external world is this inescapable web of connections that we just keep foolishly trying to tear apart, what is the goal for the individual inside that web? Because if we jump over to the opening of Book 10, Marcus lays out an aspiration for his own soul. He addresses himself and hopes for a time when his soul will be good, simple, single, more open and visible than that body by which it is enclosed.
A soul more open and visible than the body. It's such a striking image.
Yeah, it really is.
He is striving for absolute internal transparency. No masks, no pretense, no internal contradictions. And he defines true happiness entirely through this internal state. He writes that a happy soul requires zero external things. Right. It doesn't need favorable weather, it doesn't need wealth, and it certainly doesn't need the applause of men. It requires only internal contentment, trusting that all things are provided by the providence of the whole and that everything is designed for the preservation of the universe.
Which leads to this really interesting mechanical analogy he uses near the end of Book 10, and it clarifies this relationship between the internal self and the external body. He compares the human body to a tool. He says your flesh is just like a carpenter's axe, a weaver's shuttle, or a writer's pen.
It is a very stark, utilitarian way to view one's own physical form. But it perfectly encapsulates Stoic psychology.
Well, I read that and I immediately thought about how we orient our lives today. I mean, we spend an enormous amount of our time and resources just polishing the axe.
Oh, absolutely.
We obsess over our bodies, going to the gym, our skincare routines, our professional resumes, our digital avatars on LinkedIn and Instagram. We are just constantly sharpening and displaying the instrument.
We really are.
But Marcus suggests we entirely neglect the operator of the instrument. He says it's the inward cause, the mind, what he calls the dogmata, that actually swings the axe.
Yeah, and we should pause and unpack that term dogmata, because it is so crucial to understanding how Marcus operates. In modern English, when we say someone is dogmatic, we usually mean they're stubbornly clinging to an ideology without evidence, right?
Right, like an internet troll or a zealot.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But in Stoic psychology, a dogma is a foundational judgment or a decree your mind makes about reality. It is the underlying belief that generates your emotions and your actions.
Okay.
So if your dogma is that wealth equals success, your mind will swing the axe of your body relentlessly toward accumulating money, and you will feel intense anxiety when you lack it.
So the tool itself is completely neutral. Like the axe can build a house or it can destroy one. It entirely depends on the dogmata of the person holding it.
Precisely. Marcus is critiquing a value system that over-indexes on the instrument and completely under-indexes on the operator. He's demanding that he stop obsessing over the vessel, his imperial robes, his physical health, his reputation, and focus entirely on the rhetoric, the life, the dogmata hidden within, because that is the true self.
But, having this unshakable internal fortress is one thing when you're meditating alone in a quiet room. It's easy to talk about being perfectly content and loving humanity in the abstract. But how does this philosophy actually survive contact with reality?
That's the real test.
Let's talk about the crucible he was in. Because when he wrote this, as we mentioned at the start, he was dealing with some of the most intense external pressures a human being could possibly face.
The historical context is really what validates the whole philosophy. And we can piece together his reality from the subtle markers he leaves in the text. Like he mentions valiant acts against the Sarmatai in Book 10.
And who were they?
The Sarmatai were a confederation of tribes on the northern borders. Marcus spent years of his reign on the frozen frontiers of the Danube, conducting this brutal, protracted war to prevent the empire from being overrun. So he's writing these reflections in a military encampment.
And war wasn't even the deadliest thing he was facing. He explicitly references the plague in Book 9.
Right. Historically, we know this as the Antonine Plague. It was likely a strain of smallpox or measles brought back by soldiers from the east. And it was catastrophic.
Just devastating.
It really was. It devastated the Roman Empire, killing an estimated 5 to 10 million people. It eventually even killed his co-emperor Lucius Verus.
Wow.
The famous physician Galen actually fled Rome to escape it. But Marcus stayed. And look at how he analyzes it in his diary. He acknowledges the physical plague, calling it a distemper of the common air that attacks living creatures simply because they are biological organisms. But then he draws this really sharp distinction.
Yeah, he writes that the corruption of the mind is a far greater plague than the infection in the air.
And to a modern reader, that might sound like philosophical hyperbole, right? But he meant it literally. To Marcus, a virus that destroys the body is just a natural phenomenon. It's biology running its course on a biological tool.
It's just rust on the axe.
Exactly. But a corruption of the mind, falsehood, hypocrisy, arrogance, cruelty, that destroys you as a rational creature, that destroys your core function. It degrades the operator of the tool.
It's just a staggering level of moral clarity. He is actively deciding that he would literally rather die of a gruesome physical disease than survive it with a corrupt, wicked mind.
Yeah.
And you can see why he needed to reinforce that clarity daily. Throughout books 9 and 10, he constantly refers to the people around him as false, unthankful, and impudent. And he is surrounded by sycophants.
Oh, absolutely. As the absolute ruler of the ancient world, everyone wanted something from him. He was subjected to constant flattery, manipulation, political plotting.
Right. And he was highly aware of the trap of his own position. He reminds himself not to follow the archetype of past rulers, like he mentions Alexander the Great, Philip II, and Demetrius. He notes that they swaggered and conquered the world, but he questions if they ever truly understood themselves.
Yeah.
He basically says, if they lived a life of theatrical arrogance, he is not bound to imitate them. He is actively rejecting the traditional Roman model of the glorious, dominant emperor.
He recognizes that absolute power is the ultimate corrupting gravity. We saw what it did to Nero and Caligula. The Meditations is his anchor against that gravity.
So is it fair to say this diary is essentially an ego suppression mechanism? Because when literally no one can tell you no and your subjects treat you as a living deity, it must take immense, deliberate cognitive effort to remind yourself every single night that you are just a tiny, fading biological organism in a vast universe.
Ego suppression mechanism is an excellent way to describe it. He is actively fighting the neurological effects of absolute power. But it's important to note that this intense mental conditioning leads to conclusions that modern audiences often find highly uncomfortable, if not outright jarring.
Which brings us to the obstacles in this text, because to adopt his worldview, you have to embrace some deeply countercultural truths. Let's look at one of the most difficult concepts from Book 9, the idea that pleasure and pain are indifferent.
Yeah, this is a tough one.
He states that pursuing pleasure as a good or flying from pain as an evil is impious. There's that word again, impiety. How is avoiding pain an insult to the universe?
This is where Stoicism really challenges our baseline biological instincts. The Stoics categorize things into 3 buckets: good, evil, and adiaphora, or indifference. To them, the only true good is virtue, reason, justice, courage. The only true evil is vice. Everything else, wealth, health, sickness, pain, pleasure, is indifferent.
But how does he justify calling physical pain indifferent? That defies every nerve ending in the human body.
He uses empirical observation. He asks, does the universe only distribute pleasure to virtuous people? Obviously not. Tyrants and criminals experience immense luxury and physical pleasure.
Sadly, yeah.
Right. And does the universe only distribute pain to wicked people? No. Good, innocent people suffer terrible diseases and tragedies. Therefore, if nature distributes pain and pleasure indiscriminately to both the good and the bad, then pain and pleasure cannot be inherently good or evil. They must be morally neutral.
Okay, so if you declare that pleasure is good and pain is evil, you are essentially accusing the universe of being unjust and making mistakes in how it distributes these experiences.
Precisely. You are accusing reality of being wrong. To live according to nature, you must align your judgment with nature's reality. You must view them as indifferent. You don't actively seek out pain, but when it arrives, you don't treat it as a moral evil. You don't reject pleasure, but you don't orient your entire life around chasing it either.
I follow the logic, even if it's a tough pill to swallow. And he applies this same detached biological view to death itself. In Book 9, he argues that a rational person shouldn't carry themselves violently or scornfully toward death. We should wait for it, like any other natural operation.
He demystifies death by placing it in the continuum of human development. He points out that a child is conceived, carried in the womb, and delivered. A boy becomes a young man, he grows teeth, he grows a beard, his hair turns gray. All of these are natural operations according to the seasons of life.
He literally describes death as just the soul falling out of its outward coat or skin, the exact same way a fully formed infant eventually falls out of the womb. It's just a biological transition.
It removes the existential horror from it. Death is simply a dissolution into the elements you are made of. It is a necessary function for the preservation of the whole.
There is a lot of peace to be found in that perspective. I really think so. But then we hit Book 10 and we find an image that is so aggressive. it really demands some pushback. He is talking about people who grieve and complain about worldly things like loss, sickness, tragedy, and he compares them to a pig.
Oh, yeah.
I'll quote it directly. As a pig that cries and flings when his throat is cut, fancy to thyself everyone to be that grieves for any worldly thing and takes on.
The pig analogy. It is a notoriously stark image in Stoic literature.
I mean, it feels borderline sociopathic. It's one thing to say, don't complain when you are the emperor, surrounded by the best physicians and resources the ancient world has to offer, even in a war camp. But for a regular person, equating human grief like mourning a child or agonizing over a terminal diagnosis to a squealing pig being slaughtered, does this extreme Stoic detachment actually rob us of our humanity? Or is there a mechanism here I'm just missing?
Your pushback is entirely valid, and a modern psychologist might look at that quote in isolation and diagnose severe emotional suppression. But we really need to understand the precise cognitive mechanism Marcus is talking about here. The Stoics drew a sharp line between protopathia, which is the first involuntary physiological movements of emotion, and the secondary taking on of that emotion.
Meaning the initial shock versus the story you tell yourself about the shock.
Exactly. Marcus is not saying you won't feel the physiological shock of grief or pain. You will cry. Your heart will race. What he is condemning is the ascent to the impression, the performative, existential rebellion against reality, the flinging and crying against fate.
So why the pig? Why that specific image?
The pig squeals because it has absolutely no rational understanding of what is happening, and it has no choice but to suffer the knife. Marcus says later in that exact same passage, "Unto reasonable creatures only it is granted that they may willingly and freely submit unto providence. But absolutely to submit is a necessity imposed upon all creatures equally."
Oh, I see. The pig is going to die either way. The human being is going to lose their fortune or their health or their loved one either way. The external event is going to happen. The only variable is whether you go kicking and screaming in futile rebellion or whether you walk forward with rational dignity.
Yes, the submission to reality is mandatory. The willingness to accept it is the only freedom you actually possess. So is it robbing us of our humanity? Marcus would argue it is the exact opposite. By not acting like the pig, you are claiming the only uniquely human trait you have, rational consent. The animal cannot consent to reality. The human mind can.
Okay, that reframes it completely. It's not about suppressing the feeling. It's about not resisting the immutable reality of the event. But how do we evaluate this radical acceptance today? Because we live in a world where we actually can change our circumstances in ways he couldn't.
Very true.
In Book 10, he lays out what we could call a cosmic stress test. He says, "Whatsoever doth happen unto thee, thou art naturally by thy natural constitution either able or not able to bear."
It's a very pragmatic binary. If you are able to bear it, don't be offended. Just bear it. Use the natural resilience built into your constitution.
Yep.
But what if it's too much? What if the pain is too severe?
Right, he writes, "If thou beest not able, be not offended, for it will soon make an end of thee and itself." Well, I mean, it will end with thee.
If you truly cannot bear it, it will kill you. And once you are dead, the suffering ends. So in either logical scenario, whether you survive it or it kills you, there is no rational reason to be resentful.
I want to test this logic, though. Let's use a modern analogy. It's like testing the weight capacity of a bridge. You drive a massive convoy of trucks over the bridge. If the bridge doesn't collapse, it was built to hold the weight. It bore it. But modern engineering, and modern psychology for that matter, would step in and say, wait a minute. If the bridge is cracking, maybe we should reinforce the steel, or maybe we should actively reroute the heavy trucks before the bridge fails.
Right.
We believe in boundaries. We believe in changing our environment. Marcus seems to be saying, just stand there while the trucks roll over you until you either survive or get crushed. How do we reconcile his ancient fatalism with our modern agency?
That is the essential translation task when reading Stoicism today. We cannot adopt Roman fatalism wholesale, because their locus of control was vastly smaller than ours. In antiquity, you couldn't cure the plague, you couldn't establish labor laws. Today, if you are in a toxic, abusive workplace, the Stoic advice is not just bear it until the stress kills you.
Because leaving the job is actually within your control.
Right, you can quit.
Mm-hmm.
But what Marcus is getting at is the internal state while you navigate whatever is outside your control. If you're trapped in gridlock traffic on the way to the hospital, you cannot build a new highway in that moment. You must bear it. The suffering doesn't come from the traffic itself. The suffering comes from your dogma, your opinion, that traffic is a tragedy that shouldn't be happening to you right now. Marcus is giving you a tool to remove the secondary suffering.
And what's fascinating is how intellectually honest he is about why this tool works, regardless of your underlying belief system. Throughout books 9 and 10, he constantly wrestles with the two prevailing scientific and theological theories of his day. Like, is the universe guided by a purposeful providence by the gods, or is it just a random Epicurean collision of atoms and chance?
The great debate of antiquity. Providence versus atoms. Design versus chaos. And his conclusion is brilliantly pragmatic. He essentially says it doesn't matter.
Yeah, he writes, in sum, either there is a God and then all is well, or if all things go by chance and fortune, yet mayest thou use thine own providence in those things that are in thine own power.
It is a remarkable concession. He is saying if there is a divine plan, trust the plan. If it's just random atoms colliding in a void, well, at least you have reason and a tranquil mind right now. Under either system of physics, your job remains exactly the same. Be virtuous, do your duty, and maintain your internal citadel.
It reminds me of a modern quantum physicist using classical Newtonian math to calculate the trajectory of a baseball. The physicist knows Newtonian mechanics doesn't explain the fundamental truth of the quantum universe, but they use the framework anyway because it effectively solves the problem right in front of them.
That's a great way to put it.
Marcus doesn't require theological certainty to demand moral excellence. He is relentlessly focused on what works.
He is a pragmatist above all else, which is why his translations of these concepts into everyday social interactions are so incisive.
Let's dive into those translations. How does this internal fortress survive contact with other people? Let's talk about fame, reputation, and what we'd call today haters and cancel culture. In Book 10, he uses a stunning metaphor about leaves in the wind.
He quotes the poet Homer. He says, "The winds blow upon the trees and their leaves fall upon the ground. So is the generation of men." He then applies this to the entire social ecosystem around him.
He says your children are leaves. But then he looks at his critics and his fans. He notes that the people who applaud you gravely, who praise your policies, they are just leaves. The people who curse you, who privately deride you and spread rumors, they are leaves too. Even the historians who will come after you and preserve your famous memory, also leaves.
The spring comes, they bud, the wind blows them down, and new ones grow. He calls fame just smoke. If you apply this to the modern digital world, it is a devastating critique of our obsession with validation. Think about a viral social media post or a scathing performance review or getting featured in a magazine. The people praising you and the people tearing you down are identical in their impermanence. Why exhaust yourself trying to collect leaves in a windstorm?
We spend so much emotional energy trying to secure the good opinions of people whose own minds, as Marcus says, are full of conceit and opinion. If you actually looked into the minds of your critics or even your fans, you'd see they're often irrational, anxious, and confused. Why on earth would you value their judgment of you?
Exactly. And this leads to his highly practical flowchart for dealing with difficult, or what we call toxic, people. He outlines a 3-step process across books 9 and 10. Step 1 is proactive. Either teach them better if it be in thy power.
Educate them. If someone is acting poorly out of ignorance, correct them with logic and mildness. But what if they won't listen?
Step 2. Or if it be not. Remember that for this use, to bear with them patiently, was mildness and goodness granted unto thee. If you cannot change their mind, practice patience. The universe or the gods are patient with them, allowing them to exist. Why should you, a flawed human, demand immediate perfection from them?
And step 3 is where he flips the script entirely. You realize that their bad behavior fundamentally does not hurt you. He writes, "He that sinneth, sinneth unto himself. He that is unjust hurts himself."
This is crucial Stoic boundary setting. If someone lies about you or betrays you, your mind, your dogmata has not been corrupted. Theirs has. They have damaged their own rational faculty. You are completely unharmed unless you choose to become angry and compromise your own virtue in response. Their toxicity is a self-inflicted wound.
That is incredibly liberating. It means no one can drag you into the mud unless you volunteer to jump in. And he applies this same self-contained logic to doing good deeds. There's a section in Book 9 I call The Fig Tree and the Eye. He is highly critical of the transactionality of human relationships. He asks, when you do someone a favor, why are you waiting around for a reward?
He compares doing a good deed to a biological function. Does the eye demand a reward for seeing? Do the feet demand a salary for walking? No, they're simply fulfilling their natural constitution. A human being is naturally sociable and built to help others. Therefore, a human shouldn't ask for a reward for doing a good turn.
Because the action is the reward. You function correctly as a human. I want you, the listener, to pause and reflect on model culture for a second. We live in an era of LinkedIn humble brags, personal branding, and keeping a meticulous psychological scorecard in our relationships. I did this for them, they owe me.
Oh, constantly keeping score.
Right. How incredibly disruptive is it to view doing good as a mere biological function? You do it and you move on. You don't post about it. You don't harbor resentment if they aren't adequately grateful.
It is the ultimate antidote to resentment. Resentment only breeds when an expectation is violated. If your only expectation is to act in accordance with your own nature, to be the eye that sees or the human that helps, no one can ever deny you your reward.
It creates a completely self-contained, unshakable system of happiness. And what's fascinating is that Marcus didn't build this system in an echo chamber. He actively sought out wisdom from rival schools of thought, which brings us to a really interesting comparative insight in Book 9. Marcus is the devoted Stoic, but he explicitly quotes Epicurus. Why is that significant?
It's significant because the Stoics and the Epicureans were fierce philosophical rivals. They fundamentally disagreed on the nature of reality. Epicureans believed the universe was just random atoms, and that the ultimate goal of life was the pursuit of moderate pleasure and the avoidance of pain. Stoics believed in a providential universe where virtue was the only good. They were the intellectual enemies of their day.
Yet Marcus doesn't care. He recounts a story about Epicurus being deathly ill. He writes that Epicurus, while suffering immense physical pain, refused to talk to his visitors about his bodily diseases. He didn't complain about his symptoms or critique his doctors. Instead, Epicurus focused the conversation on philosophy, demonstrating how the mind could remain free, happy, and intellectually engaged despite the severe indisposition of the body.
Marcus looks at his philosophical enemy and says, "Look at his mastery over pain. I need that tool." It demonstrates Marcus's profound intellectual humility. He isn't dogmatic about the source of the wisdom. He is dogmatic about the results.
It's like a die-hard Apple executive finding profound inspiration in a Windows manual. He's completely outcome independent regarding where the truth comes from. We see this universal approach again in Book 10, when he mentions the islands of the blessed or the Elysian fields. These are concepts drawn from Hesiod and Plato, essentially the ancient Greek mythological versions of paradise or the afterlife.
But look at how he utilizes them. He doesn't use them as a literal afterlife to wait for. He internalizes the myth into a psychological state. He tells himself to strip away all his imperial titles, all his wealth, all his distractions, and shrink his identity down to just a few core words: good, modest, true, observant, contented. He says that if he can abide in those traits, he will be translated to the islands of the blessed right now.
Mental bliss right here, in the freezing mud of a military camp, simply by embracing virtue. You hear echoes of this across so many wisdom traditions. The Buddhist concept of nirvana as a waking state, or the Christian concept of the kingdom of heaven being within you. He is arriving at a universal human truth. The external world will always be chaotic, so the only viable sanctuary is the internal citadel.
And because he was a practitioner, not just a theorist, he left us with the specific cognitive exercises he used to maintain that citadel. These are the practical how-tos, the operating instructions for the mind.
Let's break those down. The first is a practice from Book 10 that I'm calling the morning calibration. He gives himself a strict rule for the very first moments of the day. He writes, "In the morning, as soon as thou art awakened, when thy judgment, before either thy affections or external objects have wrought upon it, is yet most free and impartial."
Notice the timing there, before the world gets its hooks into you, before the demands of the generals, the senators, or the servants.
In our world. Before you check your email, before you scroll the news, before you let the algorithm tell you what to be outraged about today.
Precisely. In that brief window of impartial freedom, he tells himself to put this question to his mind. If I do what is right and just today, does it matter if anyone else notices, approves, or helps me? And the answer he forces himself to acknowledge is, for sure it is not.
He is proactively severing his dependency on external validation before the day even begins. If you calibrate your independence first thing in the morning, then when the validation fails to arrive at 2:0 p.m., your psychological infrastructure doesn't collapse.
It is preventative cognitive therapy.
Okay, the next tool is from Book 9, and it's a classic, The View from Above. When you are stressed or feeling overwhelmed by a crisis, he tells you to mentally fly up to a high place. He says from some high place, as it were, to look down and to behold here flocks and their sacrifices without number and all kind of navigation, some in a rough and stormy sea and some in a calm.
He is instructing his mind to zoom out. Look at the weddings happening right now. Look at the funerals. The armies marching, the ships sinking, the babies being born. Look at the vast nations of people who have never even heard your name and don't care that you exist.
What is the actual mechanism here? Because when I think about my problems in the context of infinite time and space, I could just feel incredibly nihilistic and small.
The goal is not nihilism. The goal is amygdala deactivation. When you are caught in a localized crisis, a bad performance review, a financial hit, your brain processes it as a life or death threat. It consumes your entire field of vision. By forcing your mind to take the view from above, you cognitively reframe the scale of the problem. You realize your crisis is microscopic. It induces a sense of cosmic proportion, which relieves you of the crushing, claustrophobic burden of taking your own life too seriously.
It shrinks the monster in the room. Speaking of taking ourselves too seriously, the next tool is brilliant at deconstructing ego. Let's call it the spider and the fly reality check from Book 10. Marcus observes that a spider is incredibly proud when it catches a fly. He notes it is not little proud, nor meanly conceited of herself.
And then he scales that exact same mechanism up to human ambition. A hunter is proud of catching a hare, a fisherman is proud of catching a fish, a soldier is proud of catching a boar or a bear, or defeating the Sarmatai in battle.
He equates the glorious, decorated Roman general defeating a barbarian army to a spider catching a fly in a web. It's the exact same empty biological mechanism of a predator catching prey. I want to offer a direct application for you here. Practice looking at your own arrogant successes through this lens. You just closed a massive corporate acquisition. You won a bitter, high-profile argument on social media. You outmaneuvered a rival for a promotion. You are just a spider who caught a fly. The mechanism itself is empty. The only thing of actual value is whether your mind remained virtuous during the process.
It strips the artificial prestige away from our actions, leaving only the moral core.
Exactly. And that leads to how we handle the flies that bother us, the external hindrances. Now, Marcus uses this really interesting mechanical analogy in Book 10 about a cylinder rolling down a slope. I mean, how do you interpret that? I read it as him saying that we can't control the angle of the hill, the external events, but we can control our shape. If you're a cylinder, you roll with it. If you're a square, you drag, you get stuck, and you suffer. Is that how you see the physics of that analogy?
You're touching on the right dynamic, but Marcus is making a specific point about the unique nature of the human mind. He notes that a physical cylinder can be stopped by a rock. Water can be dammed. Fire can be smothered. Physical things meet external obstacles that halt their nature, but the rational mind is different. When an external hindrance hits you, it doesn't have to stop your progress. The mind can incorporate the obstacle into its path.
Wow, okay.
As he says elsewhere, the impediment to action advances action. You are the cylinder, but your mind has the unique capacity to turn the obstacle into the very terrain it rolls over. Next time someone cuts you off in traffic or sends you a wildly passive-aggressive email, pause. Apply this rule. Dive into their mind. Realize they are operating on flawed dogma and ignorance. Their bad behavior is their trap, not yours. You just keep rolling straight, using the hindrance as an opportunity to practice patience or courage or justice.
So the obstacle becomes the fuel. We have covered an immense amount of ground today, from the physics of an interconnected universe to the specific morning routines of a Roman emperor fighting a war and a plague. But as we wrap up, we want to leave you with one final, deeply provocative thought.
It is perhaps one of the most sobering reflections in the entire diary, found at the very end of Book 10. Marcus is contemplating his own inevitable death. And we have to remember, this is a man universally recognized as one of the few truly virtuous emperors in history. He worked tirelessly for his people. But he observes human nature with unflinching realism, and he realizes a dark truth about his own eventual passing.
He writes that no matter how good and virtuous a man is, when he dies, there will be someone standing by his deathbed secretly rejoicing. He imagines them thinking to themselves, well, now at last shall I be at rest from this pedagogue. He did not indeed otherwise trouble us much. But I know well enough that in his heart he did much condemn us.
He knows that even his closest friends, the people he protected, funded, and cared for, will feel a slight secret relief to be free of the pressure of his moral standards. They will be glad he is gone, simply so they can breathe a little easier in their own mediocrity.
It is a heartbreaking realization for him to have, but for us reading it today, it is incredibly liberating. I want to ask you, the listener, to really let this sink in. If even a perfect philosopher emperor holding all the power in the world knows that his own friends will be somewhat relieved when he dies, Why are you spending a single second of your precious life agonizing over what people think of you?
It is the ultimate release from the tyranny of external validation. You cannot win their permanent, unalloyed approval. The leaves will blow in the wind, the opinions will shift, so stop trying to control the wind. Just focus on the inward cause.
Stop trying to control the wind, just swing the axe. That's the heart of this section. This is Wisdom for the Present, where understanding leads to clarity, and clarity shapes how we see and live. We'll see you in the next episode.